Hi, gang. I thought that I might whet your appetite for my newest novel, entitled Whitewash, by reading a short little excerpt from Chapter 5, which is entitled The Interrogation. There were 3 jury seats and 2 alternate seats left when Rossi was brought back to the courtroom. Judge Lewis seemed a little perturbed that this was going on for so long and apologized to everyone. Perhaps due to the judge's tone, both sets of lawyers huddled, and when the next 6 jurors were called, the pace of questions became brisk. 3 of them were dismissed for cause. 3 of them filled the final seats in the jury box. Rossi was conflicted. At this point, he wanted to serve, but then again, he was relieved. Then Judge Lewis made Rossi's stomach flip. Would Anthony Rossi come to the alternate seat for questioning? Rossi rose and followed the bailiff's instructions. Judge Lewis explained the role of the 2 alternates. You must be here for the entire trial, but you will not be able to participate in the deliberations. This would change if any of the jurors cannot meet their commitment. Can you fulfill this commitment, Mr. Rossi? Judge Lewis asked. Yes, Your Honor. Fine. Well, the attorneys are going to ask you some questions that they asked the previous jurors. Let's start with the defense. Mr. Devlin, would you proceed? Judge Lewis fiddled with his paperwork and nodded to the table that Rossi assumed was the defense team. Devlin smiled and asked for Rossi's occupation. Well, I'm a history and English teacher. I taught high school. I taught for 33 years and just recently retired with my wife, who was also a teacher. Oh, I'm happy to hear that, Mr. Rossi. And congratulations on your long career. I'm sure your students enjoyed your lessons. He smiled, and then Devlin added, I assume this 2-week stint in federal court was not exactly in your retirement plans. For the first time, there was a ripple of laughter. Rossi let the laughter settle and said, No, sir, but I'm honored to serve. I see. Now, Mr. Rossi, you taught history. American history? Yes, sir. Then you taught your students about the First Amendment and the freedom to speak one's mind, correct? Yes, I did. It's one of the 4 freedoms. The attorney spun around to the judge and then back to Rossi. He seemed to feign surprise. Rossi thought he was being dramatic. Well, you must realize how constitutionally vital freedom of speech is. I do. Well, do you feel as a teacher that you had the right, the duty to explain both sides of issues that make up the history of our nation? Yes, sir, Rossi explained. Then he cleared his throat. When there are 2 sides. What do you mean, Mr. Rossi? Well, there are certain facts that require the truth be told. For example, the Holocaust occurred, and so did discrimination toward African Americans during the Jim Crow era. Rossi knew that the moment he said it, he was probably going to be dismissed. They probably will think I'm too biased, he thought. The defense lawyer merely smiled. He took a moment to ponder the next question, and then he stopped himself. Absolutely, Mr. Rossi. And he turned to Judge Lewis. Rossi was impassive. Devlin again addressed Rossi. I can tell your students must have had a great deal of respect for you. He pivoted, and he walked back to his table. He again regarded Judge Lewis, who was no longer fishing through his notes, but rather eyeing Rossi with a singular focus. Devlin nodded toward the other table of lawyers and announced, No further questions. Rossi was not sure what that meant. However, he had no time to ponder his situation. The judge pointed over to the table closer to Rossi. Counselor Peters? The prosecutor then strode to the podium, and she asked, Mr. Rossi, I share your views, and I wish to commend you on your service to our school system. May I ask your view on the Civil Rights Act? Rossi cocked his head. Which one? Are you asking about both? The 1964 and 1968 Civil Rights Act, I assume? Well, of course, she corrected herself and then grinned. I wasn't trying to trick the teacher. Again, there was a short burst of laughter. Rossi took a few seconds and then said, well, both of the Civil Rights Act were necessary to ensure that all people were given equal treatment under the law. Of course, they were preceded by the 1866 landmark Civil Rights Act after the Civil War. Rossi figured he may as well go out in a blaze of historical glory. Yes, indeed, Mr. Rossi. I'm sure that your knowledge of the legislation is quite thorough, sir. She turned and then looked at the other lawyer at her table and walked over to him. She whispered to her, and it was clear that both were good poker players. Then she said, this juror is acceptable to the prosecution, Your Honor. No further questions. Then Judge Lewis looked at Rossi and said, thank you, Mr. Rossi. Please take the first alternate seat. And that's an excerpt from Chapter 5 of Whitewash. Whitewash is available on Amazon and available at my own website, www.robertpacilio.net. Thank you very much, and thank you for all your support over the years.